Hello, and welcome to FFRF's Ask an Atheist. I'm Ryan Dudley, the State Policy Manager with FFRF in the Stephen Uhl Friendly Atheist Studio in Madison, Wisconsin. Our topic today is Evangelicals against Trump. In a minute, we'll be joined by our guest, Robb Ryerse from Vote Common Good. But first, I want to introduce you to my co-host today, FFRF Director of Governmental Affairs, Mark Dann, who's coming to us from Washington, D.C. Hey, Mark.
Hey, Ryan, great to be here with you. As always, we want to hear your questions, so either include them in the Facebook chat below or email them to us at askanatheist@ffrf.org.
Also, just a special disclaimer for today. Today's production of Ask an Atheist is being brought to you by the FFRF Action Fund, which is the 501c4 advocacy arm of the Freedom from Religion Foundation. FFRF Action Fund develops and advocates for legislation, regulations, and government programs to preserve the constitutional principle of separation between state and church. The FFRF Action Fund advocates for the rights and views of non-believers, endorses candidates for political office, and publicizes the views of elected officials concerning religious liberty issues. In other words, we can have a frank discussion today with you about the 2024 election and about Trump. Our guest, Robb Ryerse, is a political organizer with Vote Common Good. He spent 10 years pastoring churches in New York City, in the suburbs of Boston, and in central Michigan. He then moved to Arkansas, where he launched the Vintage Fellowship, a church that welcomed LGBTQ community and folks from all backgrounds, creeds, and colors. Vote Common Good focuses on inspiring, energizing, and mobilizing people of faith toward voting with the common good as their primary criterion, and away from Christian nationalism. They train and support candidates to effectively connect with evangelical and Catholic voters, aiming to shift political engagement toward more inclusive and common good focused policies. You can find Robb on Twitter at Robb Ryerse. It's at Robb Ryerse. So Robb, thanks for joining us today.
Hey guys, how are you?
We're doing
Wonderful. Yeah. And so before we begin our discussion with Robb, we want to hear from you with our audience question. How do you think candidates who support the separation of state and church can persuade some in the evangelical community to vote for them? Please write your thoughts and comments and keep the comments family friendly, and we might read them on the air. So Robb, before we get into your views on the election and Trump, tell us about your personal journey. When did you realize your faith, Trump, and Christian nationalism were incompatible?
Yeah. I grew up in a fundamentalist Baptist family and denomination. My dad was a pastor in that denomination. My grandfather was a pastor in that denomination, in fact, helped to start it. And we were a Baptist denomination that, just to put it on the spectrum for you, we weren't allowed to have anything to do with Southern Baptists because they were too liberal. Just to put it on the spectrum. That's where we were. So I that was what I grew up in, and went to Bible college and in seminary and became a pastor. And frankly, after about 10 years or so, I went through we now use the word deconstruction. This was before that was a popular word, but I went through a time where just all the answers I had been given just stopped making sense to me, and it began for me as a theological shift, but it pulled with it my politics and a whole bunch of other things in my life. All those things are kind of wound up together in a web. And so, I grew up, along with being a fundamentalist Christian, I was a, conservative Republican, very involved in conservative Republican activities. And then, in the midst of that shift that I went through, my politics, changed as well. And then Donald Trump being elected just further accelerated that. I joke now that the two people that have changed my life more than any others are Jesus and Donald Trump. for very different reasons. But
Right.
I've certainly shifted pretty significantly.
So, what was the reaction about your ideas with fellow members of the evangelical community and your family?
Yeah. Um, eh, Not great.
Right.
Like a lot of folks who since 2016, 2015, 2016 and beyond, um, I have at times have had rather strained relationships with family members. Um, I before the election in 2016, I remember being on the phone with my mom and I'm not super proud of this, but I maybe had the biggest argument I've had with my mom since I was a teenager,
Mm,
just begging her not to vote for Donald Trump. And
mm,
of course she did. And so it's been at times it's been difficult. When we went through the shift that we did theologically, we lost our
right.
we lost our network. We had friends who told us we don't want to hear from you. We don't want to hear what you're up to. So we went through a bit of that kind of excommunication.
Mm,
But the tension that has existed since Trump's election has been frankly even greater than what we experienced 15 years before that when we were making the shifts that we did.
So, what did you see in society that other people in the evangelical community just aren't seeing or choose not to see? How is it that you view the world differently than a lot of your former compatriots?
Yeah, that's a great question. um, I think there's a number of things. I think one of the things that to understand kind of evangelical and fundamentalist Christians, um, there is a basic belief that human beings are bad.
Mm,
The idea of original sin, the idea that we're born with a sin nature,
mm,
and because of that we deserve punishment from God. Um, and so that is a really prevalent belief about people, which I think
mm,
subconsciously makes it easy for Christians at times to, I think there's a cognitive dissonance that happens between we need to love our neighbor and love the people around
right.
us. And that's what Jesus told us to do. So we
Right.
ought to do it. And well, everyone around me is evil. How can I love that? And I'm not even sure God loves them, because if God does, they're all going to hell. If God's sending them to hell, so I'm not sure if God actually loves them. So I think there's that cognitive dissonance that happens,
Yeah.
that I think that's one thing. I also I do a lot of climate change work right
Mhm,
now, with an organization called The Week, that is
mhm.
that it's bringing um, conversations about climate change to the broad middle in the United States, and it's really really amazing work that's being done. Um, and that notwithstanding, I tend to have an optimistic view of the future.
Good.
Um, and I think that most evangelical Christians have a very pessimistic view of the future.
Mm,
Things are just getting worse and worse, and
right.
ultimately until there's some Armageddon, and then we get raptured out of here and Jesus comes back. But things are just going to get worse and worse and worse and worse and worse. So there's no sense fighting the chaos. There's the chaos is all part of that, and so there's not a vested interest in trying to make the world a better place, and that's rather unfortunate. So I think those are a couple of things that how most Christians view other people, and
Mm.
how most Christians view the world, and particularly the future. I've had some pretty significant shifts in those things, and I think the beliefs that they have about those things, produce fruit that is detrimental to not only themselves but society as a whole.
That's an awful lot, trying to hold the love thy neighbor and then the original sin in your head.
Yes.
And I can see how that causes a lot of problem. And also the idea that things aren't getting better, they're getting worse. And we'll talk a little bit more about this in other parts of the show, but more in the Christian nationalist ideas that you're seeing in that everything is just getting worse, and go back to the good old times and whatnot. And just one thing to kind of close out this segment, are there a lot of people in the evangelical community who think like you do and realize something isn't right with a lot of the doctrines and theology, but are still staying put?
Yeah, that's a great question. There has about 20 years ago, there was a movement called the Emergent Church. And it was folks like Brian McLaren and Doug Paget and others who were Tony Jones, who were leading a kind of a reimagining of what church community could be like. And the church that my wife and I started was, very much in that stream. There was a lot of hope that would continue to grow. I think the Trump presidency really shattered a lot of people's kind of rose-colored glasses about, we're all going to get along and everything's going to be okay, and really kind of highlighted how deep some of the divisions are. And so there are evangelical Christians that have gone through these kinds of shifts. I mean, so much so now that we've got there's a name for it. It's called deconstruction. Most of them end up leaving evangelicalism as opposed to staying put and trying to fight for something different. And so that's what we've seen, I think, over the last 20 years, is that there was a lot of people who tried to do something different within evangelicalism and then ended up realizing that they needed to move into a different space.
Oh, that's quite a lot. Okay, back to you, Ryan.
Yeah, I kind of want to talk about evangelicals in their terms of being voters. So can you tell us a little bit about how evangelicals and their voters, or evangelical voters, and how they can be persuaded not to vote for Trump and other Christian nationalist candidates? As what types of messages, messengers, and tactics are effective in reaching these voters?
Yeah. One of the things that we found with Vote Common Good is that persuasion isn't necessarily the way to go. What we have observed is that there is 5 to 15% of white evangelical and white Catholic voters that are flippable. Now, that means that there's 85 to 95% that aren't flippable, which, if you focus on that, is kind of discouraging. But in a close election, 5 to 15% of white evangelicals and white Catholics can absolutely make a difference in an election. We saw that in Michigan in 2020. It was white evangelicals and white Catholics in 2 counties in Michigan that gave Joe Biden his because they flipped, and 2 counties in Michigan went for a Democrat for the first time in 30 years. Because of that, Joe Biden won the state of Michigan and the presidency. So it's really significant. Now, what we've seen is that people are going through. These flippable voters are going through a bit of a political identity crisis. They're beginning to question and maybe they haven't even verbalized it yet, but there's stuff happening in their heads that they're saying, I'm not sure I can do this anymore. And there's a number of reasons for that. For some, it was Trump's election. For many, it was kids in cages, January 6th, the Dobbs decision, significant number of evangelical voters who identify as pro-life who saw the Dobbs decision as just being, too far, and have, made shifts as a result of that. Now, our work at Vote Common Good, part of our approach is we are not trying immediately to change people's identity. Like, we're not trying to get, more Christians to identify as Democrats, more evangelical Christians to identify as Democrats. If they do, that's great. But we're not primarily focused on identity shift, because shifting someone's identity, how they think about themselves, how they view themselves, really, really difficult. Takes a long time. What we are much more interested in doing is shifting people's behavior, and meaning how they vote. And so part of our work is working with Democratic candidates and helping them connect better with religious voters, religiously motivated voters, and I talk to them about how they need to be an exceptional candidate. And what I mean by that is they need to be the type of candidate that someone would make an exception for. So, that's the person who would say, I would never vote for a Democrat, but I would vote for her.
Okay.
I would never vote for a Democrat, but I would vote for him. Like, that's an exceptional candidate. So we had an example of that here in Arkansas. My best friend, college roommate, conservative, Republican, evangelical Christian, on Election Day sent me a picture of his ballot. He has never voted for a Democrat in his life. Period. Never voted for a Democrat in his life. And he sent me a picture of his ballot on Election Day, and there were people that he voted for that just turned my stomach, quite frankly. But the top of his ballot, he voted for Dr. Chris Jones instead of Sarah Huckabee Sanders to be governor of Arkansas. And he voted for Kelly Kraut to be lieutenant governor of Arkansas instead of Leslie Rutledge. It was the first time in his life he'd ever voted for two Democrats. And the reason for that is because Chris and Kelly were exceptional candidates, like people that he was willing to make an exception for. Now, here's the thing that happens.
What made them exceptional?
Oh, their demeanor. Well, also their opponents. That helps when you're running against Sarah Huckabee Sanders and Leslie Rutledge. It makes it a little bit easier. But Chris Jones, for instance, is the nicest and smartest person in any room he's in, and that combination's really fantastic. And they're both. Chris in particular is super reasonable and moderate. I joke with him that he's much more moderate than I am, but but I love him so much and the work that he does that's totally okay. But the thing is when someone makes that kind of exception, when they change their behavior just once, when they say, okay, I'm not going to vote for Donald Trump in this election. We're not asking you to change your identity. We're just saying, listen, don't vote for Donald Trump this time around.
Right.
And the dirty little secret is the secret sauce with this approach is that once those dominoes begin to fall, they fall. And
other things coming.
Exactly. As soon as you begin to shift in one area, it's like a web that begins to pull. And, it started from my friend. It started in 2016, he voted for Evan McMullin for president because he couldn't vote for Donald Trump.
Right.
In 2020, he left the presidential line blank and just didn't vote. Voted for everything else, but not the presidential line. And then in 2022, he was voting for a Democrat for governor of Arkansas. Those shifts begin to happen.
This thing. And then, so just, is it less on a candidate's, it's more about who the candidate is than less on their policy? Is that a fair assumption to make to find these exceptional candidates?
Yeah, one of the things that we talk about at Vote Common Good is that a candidate's we say that the messenger is equally as important as the message.
Okay.
And you know, Democrats have this idea that all you have to do is put forward like good policy and people will jump on board.
Right.
And there's kind of like a very mind-focused or brain-focused approach, a very rational approach to things. And what many Democrats have failed to understand is that people don't make rational decisions. People make decisions for other reasons, often, emotionally. And so you've got to be able to connect with people on a personal level. One of the things that we talk with candidates about during our training is that you don't have to be like a group of people, but you have to like them. Okay. So, for instance, our executive director and I were having coffee with a congresswoman. Because of the story, I'm not going to name her, but a rather influential and known congresswoman, Democratic congresswoman, and we were talking with her, and she said to us, "Those evangelicals freak me out." And part of me we're like, yeah, like we get that. Like, you're talking to a couple of guys who have spent, their adult lives as evangelical pastors. Like, they freak us out too. But when your attitude is those people freak me out, like that's gonna come through. They're gonna sense that. And what Donald Trump has proven is, you don't have to be an evangelical Christian to get evangelical Christians to support you. Because Donald Trump is not, and it's the furthest thing from it in a lot of ways. But he's communicated, "Hey, I like you. I see you. I understand where you're at. I get where you're coming from." And we want Democratic candidates to be able to communicate those same things, not in a way that panders. Like, we're not talking about like changing policy or pandering in any way, because we think that in many ways, Democratic policy is would be much more in line with the faith values of religiously motivated voters. But it begins with communicating that and doing that in an authentic way. I remember in 2018, we did an event in California with a congressional candidate, and he came to speak, and it was like he had tried to memorize John 3:16 in the car on the way to the event. and it just was like, it just didn't, it just went over like a lead balloon because it was inauthentic. It was pandering. It was like, the person who can share their own faith journey or their own story in an authentic way and communicate like, "Hey, I see you. I get where you're coming from. I might have a different approach, but I get where you're coming from." That's the kind of person that people will gravitate to.
Wow. So, and as we talk a little bit about the rise of Trump and Christian nationalism, does the evangelical community bear some responsibility in the rise of Trump and Christian nationalism?
Some responsibility.
Okay. Another word. What's a better way to phrase that?
Yeah. One of the things, Vote Common Good got started by essentially a group of white evangelical pastors who saw what our tribe had done and was like, it's our we're a part of this group. You can't listen. We can't say, "Oh yeah, but I'm a progressive evangelical. I'm not one of those." Like, you can't cut the prosciutto that thinly. It's just like, come on. Like, this is and our executive director, Doug Padgett, likes to say, our DNA is all over this crime scene. And And so rather than just complain about it on Facebook, we decided to get organized. And the actual original idea for Vote Common Good was, and we didn't end up doing this, but we ended up doing political rallies instead. But we almost did a "We Know What We Did" tour that was kind of a repentance tour. So yes, and Donald Trump in particular, absolutely. There is, I mean, in 2012, 2014, Pat Robertson was advocating for, coaching, mentoring Donald Trump and bringing him into evangelical circles so that he could get the support of evangelical leaders. And, Donald Trump was essentially Pat Robertson's, handpicked candidate. And so, yes, evangelical Christians are absolutely responsible for, and evangelical leadership is absolutely responsible for Donald Trump.
It's really interesting. And so can you tell us a little bit about what the mainstream media does not understand or may not understand about the relationship between Trump and the evangelical community?
Yeah. And it's, I hear this in the media, but I also hear this all the time in conversations with people. It's the hand-wringing question of I just don't understand how an evangelical Christian could support a man like this. And that was I remember back to 2016 and the argument I had with my mom. That was the argument I was having with her. I'm like, this isn't how you raised me. I remember what you thought of Bill Clinton. How can you support this guy? And it was very much that his character doesn't line up with our values. So how do we understand that? And I think that the media doesn't always understand that there's evangelical Christianity is not a monolithic thing.
Right.
There are some evangelical Christians who voted for Donald Trump holding their nose simply because he was the Republican candidate, the pro-life candidate, whatever it might be. There are, in particular, it was very much a team-oriented thing. There's a significant number of evangelical Christians who voted for Donald Trump simply on the abortion issue and wanting Roe v. Wade overturned, and then there is a significant number of evangelical Christians that often fall into kind of the charismatic and Pentecostal side of things, kind of the prosperity gospel, some of the televangelists you'd see on TV, that kind of approach, that believe that Donald Trump has been appointed by God to be the president of the United States. And there's a thing called the 7 mountains theory. And it's the idea that there are 7 mountains, and this goes back to Moses going up on Mount Sinai. And so there's 7 mountains of cultural influence where God's man, it's almost always a man, God's man needs to be, in a position of power and influence. And so those 7 mountains are family, entertainment, media, education, government, business, and I'm blanking on the 7th one, but those are 6 of the 7 mountains.
Right.
And so they're those who believe in this 7 mountains approach, view Donald Trump it doesn't matter if he's a Christian. It doesn't matter if he is cheated on his wife or paid off a porn star or, is convicted of rape or, is convicted of fraud or, stealing classified documents or election interference or any of it. None of that stuff matters because he's God's chosen person to be in this position of influence. And they would draw parallels to like King Cyrus in the Bible, who was like this, pagan king that God used for God's purposes. And they would say, well, that's Donald Trump is that kind of person. And so, he's God's anointed person to be in leadership. And that's that's a really scary thing, because then then they'll quote, there's a verse in the Bible where there's a story where King David was going to become king, but Saul was already king, and David had a chance to kill Saul and become king, and he didn't. And he said, touch not God's anointed. Like, if God's picked somebody to be king, like, you better keep your hands off them. And if that's the approach that you've got for Donald Trump, like, that's a pretty scary prospect.
And hence January 6th and a lot of other stuff. And also what you said earlier, it was that within the Seven Mountains, Pat Robertson, I would think, seems to check a lot of those boxes, and Donald Trump seems to check a lot of those boxes as well. So the end point successor makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, for sure. And this is the thing about January 6th. If Donald Trump is God's appointed one to be the president of the United States, the only way to thwart God's plan, is to steal the election. And so there's January 6th and Christian nationalism are absolutely connected. And this is, I wish the media would tell this story more. The QAnon shaman, the guy in the horns and the painted face, on January 6th, he and a group of other men breached the Senate dais, and he prayed a prayer from the Senate dais about how, in Jesus' name, about how they were there to overthrow the globalists and the communists and to bring God's white light to the country. Yep. It was totally a Christian nationalist motivated event for many of the people involved. And that's because the only way God's appointed man couldn't be president would be if the evil heathen pagans, stole it.
Wow. All right. Back to you, Ryan, on that one.
Yeah, I get to follow off that, huh? No, that is absolutely terrifying. I remember watching January 6th, just like an anecdote from, I was in the hospital with my son, and it was just baffled that all this was happening, and then watching things kind of unfold and kind of understanding the Christian nationalist perspective behind it is absolutely terrifying. So I guess that so what's it going to take for the GOP to kind of rid themselves of this MAGA, ultra Christian nationalist, this place they've put themselves?
Yeah. A few years ago, I was watching the Heaven's Gate documentary series that was on HBO, I think, and you remember Heaven's Gate was that cult with the people in the Nikes and the purple jumpsuit or tracksuits that were going to get picked up by the spaceship that was in the tail of the Hale-Bopp comet. In the midst of that, there was a woman interviewed who was described as the foremost authority on cults in the United States, and she, is just an offhanded comment, mentioned the idea of political cults. And so I was super intrigued by that, ended up Googling her and getting a hold of her. And she came on the Vote Common Good podcast and talked with Doug and I about this idea of political cults. And something that she said was that has stuck with me. And she said that when people who are not in cults look at different incidents that happen and think, okay, this is going to be the thing that breaks that my loved one or breaks this thing. The spaceship doesn't show up. in the tale of the Hale-Bopp comet. The world doesn't end on the day it was supposed to. This prophetic thing doesn't happen. She said, what you'd expect is for people to have like a rational thought of like, oh, well, maybe this didn't happen, so I'm going to question everything. And she said, what actually happens with the majority of people is that they double down. They don't have a rational break. They actually double down in support of the cult. And we've seen that with, the Trump cult and the MAGA folks. I keep asking the question, well, what's it going to take? Like, is it, it's going to be the Access Hollywood tapes. This is it. Like, this is the thing. It was.
This is it. This is John McCain. This is everything.
Yeah. It's going to be this. It's going to be this. It's going to be this.
Any day.
January 6th. It's going to be the mugshot. This will be and now I'm at the point where I'm like, there's not going to be a thing. Wow. Like, the people that are in the cult are going to keep doubling down, and everything that happens is not the type of thing that will bring about a break. It will simply, harden their resolve. Now, what does that mean for the Republican Party? I think it means the Republican Party is going to cease to exist, or is going to exist in a very different form. One of the actually slightly encouraging things coming out of this primary election has been the number of Nikki Haley voters who are saying that they aren't going to vote for Donald Trump in the primary. And that seems to be, a trend that's, if that holds, is going to be, encouraging. The question becomes and both President Biden and Donald Trump have significant issues within their own party. And what's going to happen, like which group comes home, it might very well determine the election. And if, the 60% of Nikki Haley voters who are saying they won't vote for Donald Trump don't come home to Donald Trump, he's going to have a hard time winning.
Yeah, that's such an interesting point. I just want to pause here for a second, take a few minutes, and I want to let everybody know, be sure to answer today's audience question. How do you think candidates who support the separation of state and church can persuade some in the evangelical community to vote for them? Now let's continue our conversation with Robb Ryerse from Vote Common Good.
So, Robb, currently your job now consists of working with candidates in faith-based communities to uphold the Love in Politics pledge, which calls for faithful voters to support candidates who pledge to comport themselves and in their public and political lives in the ways of love consistent with 1 Corinthians 13. Many folks might know that from a wedding they've been to, love is patient, love is kind, and for candidates who abide by these ideas. So talk more a little bit about that.
Yeah. We ask candidates, our work with Vote Common Good is not about adherence to a particular set of policies. Often people will say, well, you say Vote Common Good. What's good? What is good? And we often say that, like, the things that are good, like, you kind of know them when you see them. A little bit like pornography. You kind of know it when you see it.
You know it's looking.
But it's not about, okay, if you believe X, Y, or Z, like, that's what's good. It's much more about a shared set of values that say, listen, we're going to work for justice for everyone. We're gonna operate with compassion. We're not just gonna be on the side of the rich and powerful. We're gonna think about the needs of others. All those things that seem just so common sense in a lot of ways. But so many evangelical voters, when they go in the voting booth, they're just thinking about themselves. Which candidate's going to give me the biggest tax cut? That's the one I'm going to vote for. And that's like this inherently selfish thing. There's this verse in the Bible that says, do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit, but consider others before you consider yourself.
Right.
And if you take that seriously, like do nothing out of that. Like that includes voting. So don't vote out of your own
Trump.
self-interest. Don't you can't vote out of your own self-interest. So, we ask candidates, so voters, we ask to use the common good as their voting criteria. So we ask candidates who are running for office, listen, if you're elected, will you use the common good as your governing criteria? And so the Love and Politics pledge is about the level of toxicity that exists in our system, and it includes this sense of like, listen, you can call somebody out, you can be, you can be honest, you go negative, but be truthful, like tell the truth, and don't do it in a name calling, unnecessarily mean. We've all seen that, and it's exhausting. It's not good for the country, and we think our leaders ought to do better.
So are you finding, is there more uptake with the Love and Politics pledge with Democratic candidates, Republican candidates, or a little bit of both?
The vast majority of our work is with Democratic candidates. We have 40 candidates for common good so far this year, which are candidates running for any office up and down the ballot that have said, I will use the common good as my governing criteria. We have 40 so far in this cycle, and all 40 of them are Democratic candidates.
Okay. And are there specific races you're focusing on, or you're targeting, or you really want to see come over?
Yeah. So our first priority is the presidential race.
Right.
Our first priority is keeping Donald Trump out of the White House. And so because of that, like in 2020, much of our work will be focused on the swing states. We'll be in Wisconsin, we'll be in Michigan, we'll be in Pennsylvania and Georgia and North Carolina, and out in Arizona. We will, we're going to be in Arizona next week. The work has already started. And so we're very focused on that because we're going to be in those areas, because we tour the country in a big bus and do events. We do trainings on Christian nationalism. We host forums on faith and democracy and having conversations about how those things work together, and how a person of faith ought to engage in the democratic process and not engage in the democratic process, how they shouldn't do it. And then we also do political rallies. And so many of the candidates that we'll be working with are congressional and local candidates that are in the swing states that we're already going to be in. So, the very first event we ever did was in 2018 was with Susan Wild in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania.
Yes, member of the Congressional Free Thought Caucus. We know her well.
Yes. And the very first event was with Susan, and we've gone back to Bethlehem and to do. Yeah, I know. I always joke. I say our first event was in Bethlehem because good things start in Bethlehem. A little pastor joke there. Yeah, so we'll be doing events with Susan to help her be reelected. Chris Deluzio, we helped get elected in 22, and we'll be back helping him this cycle. We're excited about the candidates in Wisconsin 3rd district, 3rd congressional district. Rebecca Cook in particular is I say, like, it's a little bit like having kids. You love all your kids, but you do have your favorite, right?
Right.
I'm joking, of course. We love all of our candidates, but we do have some that are our favorites, and Rebecca is one of those candidates that we love. So yeah, we're gonna be primarily in those states, and then focused on doing events with candidates in those districts, in those states that are most competitive, and hopefully moving that 5 to 15% of people that can make a difference.
Great. In 2018, you actually ran for Congress as a Republican in a safe GOP district in Arkansas, with the premise that voters might be ready for some common sense Republican. Sadly, they were not. What lessons did you take away from that experience?
Oh, goodness. Yeah, folks have watched the Netflix documentary Knock Down the House, which tells the story of 4 candidates who were recruited to run by brand new Congress and then Justice Democrats. The idea of brand new Congress was, what if we had Democrats in deep blue districts and Republicans in bright red districts that could run across party lines, but have a shared set of priorities. And so we tried this experiment of primarying a conservative Republican from the left in the Republican primary. It didn't work. But it was quite an experience that led to lots more opportunities for me. And so lessons that I learned. I learned how important money in politics is, and not in a good way. At the start of my campaign for Congress in 2018, if I listed my top 10 issues, I'm not sure campaign finance reform would have made the top 10. And now I think it's the number 1 issue in terms of policy issues. I think every other thing that you care about, whether it's immigration or healthcare or whatever it is, it is the way it is because of how we fund our elections. And so, if we're going to treat this, let's go after the disease rather than just treating the symptoms. So that's one thing. I also learned, I'm just it's easy to be cynical about politics. It's easy to be cynical about people and to think, people are apathetic and they don't vote, or I had the opportunity to meet so many really amazing people here in my own area, in Arkansas's 3rd Congressional District, that were just so inspiring. Like, people making a difference in the world in their own way, and they're doing it in ways others would never know about. And I had the opportunity to meet so many amazing people that it really was an inspiring thing for me, that okay, this work matters, and because there's people out here doing work. And so I'm gonna focus in on this. This is my work in the world, and I'm gonna do it with the same kind of energy and persistence that I've seen so many people across my district employ in their own ways.
Fantastic. So we have a clip from the documentary about your race called True Believer, about why you're running as a Republican, or why you were running as a Republican.
Yeah. We had another question come in. I'm just looking it up on my phone. It's about why I'm running as a Republican. I'm running as a Republican because I am a Republican. I'll just kind of walk back through some history. The last time we had significant immigration reform, it was Ronald Reagan who signed that into law. The Environmental Protection Agency was started by a Republican president. There are Republicans who are running in races saying, listen, the direction our party is going is not okay, and rather than walk away, we're going to stay in and fight for something different.
So would you still consider yourself a Republican?
No, not anymore. No, yeah. I used to joke on the Vote Common Good tour that I was a Republican who traveled the country campaigning for Democrats, because that's what Donald Trump has done to us. Now, I'm not super party loyal. I have supported Democratic candidates and work here in Arkansas to get Democratic candidates elected and do that around the country. But I'm not registered as a party member anymore, and think that the whole party structure is more limiting than it is beneficial.
Robb, I would love to sit here and just chat with you all day. I have like a million questions that I keep thinking of as we continue this discussion, but we are running out of time, so I want to get to some questions from our audience.
Yeah.
So the first one is, do you think that the two parties will ever be able to work together again, or have the years of political division caused too much of a rift between them?
That's a good question. I think that there will be some things where they'll continue to work together, defense spending, for instance, funding the military. But I think, these ridiculous examples of political showmanship, and where they play political chicken with each other, like we're seeing with, once again with the shutdown kind of looming. Right. I hope these things become less common, but I don't know if I don't know if the pendulum has swung, has reached its apex yet and has begun to swing back, or which direction. Where I think it's eventually going to swing back, but I don't know if we're still on the way out or if we're on the way back yet. I don't know. I don't think we'll know that for a bit. I think the best thing that could happen for the two parties would be for there to be more than two parties, and which would cause actual compromise, actual deal making, actual negotiating, to build coalitions rather than I'm on team blue or I'm on team red, and only thinking about that without any other consequence.
Yeah. So I'm going to ask you to tap into your crystal ball here for a second. And I really like the way this question is framed because I think it gives a perspective on where we are. So do you think there's a clear path that will allow Donald Trump to be defeated in the election?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Yes. I think I think ultimately it comes down to about 70,000 voters in a couple of states. That's what it comes down to. What we saw, and I go back to what we saw in Michigan, in Western Michigan, where Grand Rapids is and Holland is, Ottawa County and Kent County, Michigan, those counties went for Joe Biden. If you know anything about those counties, Grand Rapids, Michigan is like one of the evangelical meccas. It's like Colorado Springs, and it's an evangelical mecca, and it went for Joe Biden. And so did Holland in Ottawa County, which is very Dutch Reformed. And I think that it's because we had 5 to 15% of the white evangelicals in that area, flipped, and I think we're going to see that. There was an interesting article in Politico the other day that it was a couple weeks ago, and it actually stated the case of Vote Common Good in the opposite. It said if Trump can flip only 3% of Biden's evangelical support, he can win the election. And I found that interesting because that's exactly what we say with Vote Common Good, just the other way around. If we can flip 5 to 15% of evangelical support for Republicans, we'll win elections. So I think the table is stacked against Donald Trump. Now, is it impossible? I will freely admit that the vast majority of predictions I have made about Donald Trump have been completely wrong. I was like, no, don't worry about this. He's never going to win the presidency. So who knows? But I don't think I think that the path to his victory is super complicated and not very viable.
Okay, well, I think we have to end on that note, which is a good note to end on because that gives me with a little bit of optimism. But we are running out of time. I really love this conversation. I wish we could go for another hour, like I said. But unfortunately, that concludes Ask an Atheist for this week. Thank you so much for joining us, Rob. We really appreciate it.
Thanks. I've really enjoyed the conversation. We should do it again.
Absolutely. And don't forget, we also have a weekly broadcast TV show, Free Thought Matters. This week, Dan Barker and Annie Laurie welcome University of Tampa sociology researcher Ryan Cragen. Here's a preview.
So I ask my students, okay, how many of you know how an internal combustion engine works? And I might get one student out of a class of 30 who's like, oh, I worked on a car with my dad. I have a sense of what's going on here. But the vast majority are like, I have no idea how an internal combustion engine works. I said, okay, but if it breaks down, how many of you are going to call a priest to come fix your car and just like pray over it and then anoint it with oil or holy water? And they're like, well, that's ridiculous. And I said, and that is modern ways of thinking. You don't think that cars work on magic.
All right, you can see Free Thought Matters on TV stations all across the U.S. and on FFRF's Facebook and YouTube channels. This week on Free Thought Radio, Dan Barker will talk with Enrico Nalati, author of the book Flourishing Love, A Secular Guide to Lasting Intimate Relations. You can find out how to hear Free Thought Radio at ffrf.org/radio. And don't miss the latest episode of We Dissent podcast. FFRF's Rebecca Merkert and Lindsay Bell join Alice Hill discussing the state legislative segment. Listen and subscribe to We Dissent wherever you listen to podcasts. Check us out online at wedissent.org. For more information about the Freedom from Religion Foundation, check out the website at ffrf.org. If you're a member already, thank you. If not, please join us. See you next week on FFRF's Ask an Atheist.